Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today, 5 Best Practices for Asset and Configuration Management Success. A few quick notes before we start. Your phone lines are muted, so if you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel. Please be sure to send your questions to all presenters. That helps me assign the question. Secondly, Jeff will be doing a demo later on in the presentation, so you may want to find your full screen mode now on the toolbar. This will help you see the details in Jeff's demo. And lastly, I will be sending out an email no later than tomorrow, and it will include both the recording from today's event as well as a copy of the slide deck that the presenters are using. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Don Casson, CEO of Evergreen. Don?
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon. I'm Don Casson, and with me today is my normal co-host, Jeff Benedict, who heads up Evergreen's ITSM practice and leads our innovation efforts. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome, and if you're a past attendee, thanks for coming back. Our goal, as always, is to share valuable information and insights you can use right now. Here's our agenda. After a very little bit about Evergreen, we'll dive into the topic. Beyond that, we'll briefly demonstrate some of the concepts discussed in our always evolving view of a very advanced self-service portal and catalog experience built on ServiceNow. Then we'll answer any questions if you have any. Evergreen is a US-based consulting firm, and we've worked with hundreds of mid-market, Fortune 1000, and public sector organizations to improve their IT service management. Over the past 20 years, we're 20 years old, we have delivered more than 4,000 ITSM projects. We are a full lifecycle firm, meaning we have both process and technology consulting in one company, which makes it more of a one-stop shop. We're also one of a few top-tier or gold US ServiceNow partners in services, application development, and training. As a certified applications developer, we develop solutions for the platform, which are sold in the ServiceNow store, and they must be built and tested to the same standards as ServiceNow themselves. The benefit to you, we believe, is higher quality. As we talk with our customers, ServiceNow customers out there, they tell us that this is their biggest problem, meeting their ServiceNow demand. They tell us demand exceeds resources, but it can have peaks and valleys. Skilled resources are scarce, and it can take 6 to 12 months to really become capable. Then they get hired away. Also, we may not have a true solution architect to lead us. When our people need help, where can they turn? Is a wiki enough? And even with expensive consultants like Evergreen, contracts, task orders, and invoicing are a lot of work. We educate them on our business, then because they can't stay very long, they're gone. This is how most of our customers try to handle this. We've got a core internal ServiceNow team augmented by outside consultants on a project-by-project basis with possible offshore technical support. We're so used to doing it this way, we may not stop to think how hard and inefficient this motion actually can be. We think the traditional service approach is broken. We created Evergreen Evolve to fix it. There's a huge amount of waste in project-based activity that neither of us benefit from. Due to scheduling issues, it's hard for us to get our resources billable more than 70 or 75% of the time. So 25% gets wasted. We also have a saying in consulting, which usually gets a laugh, but I won't be able to hear you, that the first project with the correct scope is the second one. We all know what that means. And so another 15 to 20% gets lost in risk allowance to account for scope issues, for an astounding total of 40 to 45% waste. This is why the going market rate for services is so high. Evergreen Evolve is very different. It's a part to full-time team of senior implementation certified ServiceNow experts specifically dedicated to you over a 6-month period, so our team and your team become one team. You get dedicated US thought leadership and our engagement managers and senior solutions architects who work closely with our offshore team of dedicated senior certified developers. Evergreen Evolve gives you one flexible contract to help you meet all of your tactical and strategic ServiceNow demand. Because Evolve captures a huge amount of waste, we can pass the savings on to you. Best of all, there is no long-term lock-in, which you would normally see in staff augmentation or outsourced kind of contracts. You can cancel an involved contract at any time with 30 days notice. Okay, so let's get into our topic today. As we often do, covering a few ITIL definitions is useful for getting us on the same page, and 4 are relevant today. Asset and configuration can get confused and seem to have a lot of overlap. Key to keeping this more clear is in the definition, tracking and reporting the value and ownership of assets. Thinking value and ownership can be more financial and control-oriented and leads naturally to thinking about contractual or third-party vendor supporting relationships. A configuration item is something that is needed to deliver an IT service. A CI is a managed component. While not everyone realizes this, it can be hardware, software, a process, or even a person. So when we think CI, we think more about readiness, current state, and availability. In other words, is the CI ready to do its job when there is a request for service? Configuration management is the process that maintains accurate information about the CIs being used to deliver IT services. The CMDB is simply a place where we store this data over time and how it relates to other data, or CIs. Service Asset and Configuration Management, or SACM, ties it all together. It's a combination of asset data and configuration data to ensure that accurate and reliable information about an asset is available when it's needed to support a service, including its configuration and relationship to other assets. Logically, our first best practice is to look within and seek to understand why it hasn't worked before now. Guy Kawasaki, who's a pretty famous technologist and inventor, said once he said, hey, we've got to get better reality. And the key to getting better reality is to find out why things haven't worked. So why has asset management failed to deliver its promised value? Right off the bat, it's hard to get the data across the enterprise. Challenging access, that can be a tough one. Different tools, different collection methods, and different repositories tend to make up what we call enterprise asset data and collection. It's a patchwork quilt for most of us. So it's not surprising that we have redundant, often conflicting stores of data that we need to rationalize, and problems with consistent naming conventions and incomplete and fragmented discovery information which needs to be normalized and then compared to license entitlement, which may have its own complex rationalization process to get to equivalent license entitlement. Then, for the same reasons above, it's difficult to gather, rationalize, and align contract and vendor information, which is not discoverable, obviously, with the asset data. Last, did we do this top-down? Did we clearly understand who would use the data and why? The key use cases, which would give us customer-centered perspective on what we were collecting and organizing. In most cases, asset management has been done bottom-up, collecting a massive amount of confused and possibly conflicting data with varying degrees of accuracy, and then failing under the weight of complexity and lack of purpose. So we can ask the same question about configuration management. The reasons are important if we don't want to make the same mistakes again. The biggest reason by far is this: configuration management was a solution in search of a problem. As we often see in IT, we're really good at doing things. We tackle big complex things and wrestle them to the ground in a large-scale way. But we aren't really good at asking why or how this will be used. Does that make sense? And what is the least we can do rather than the most? Even though ITIL defined configuration management and the CMDB, there weren't really any best practices for how to succeed with it. So we've been on our own to try to figure that out. The amount of detail we began to capture was massive, and we all got lost in it. Then, as we involved others in the effort, since we didn't know why we were collecting the data, we lacked purpose that we could share with others to help us all do the same thing. It's also fair to say there was plenty of devil in the detail. Data sources are all over the map, inconsistent, inaccurate, duplicative, and contradictory. Our Big Bang approach to collecting and storing all the data didn't help with that. Last, I think it's fair to say that manually Aggregated, gathered, and maintained CMDBs at other than the highest, most simple levels are not sustainable and shift constantly in a virtualized and cloud world future. Without really good application discovery technology, it's certainly a lot harder to do this. Why comes before what? Charles Kettering, the famous 20th century inventor and head of GM Research, once said, "A problem well stated is half solved." If we really clearly know why, what becomes a whole lot easier. So we want to spend time on why until we are satisfied that we have it clear. What benefits can asset management bring? Remember, we're focusing on the value and ownership of the asset. From a planning perspective, we can use ITAM history to decide on asset class decisions, such as hardware from one vendor versus that same thing from another vendor. It can be helpful in project and portfolio planning. Say we're considering a major application upgrade with an estimated $1 million price tag, but by looking at the asset data, we find that we may have a significant hardware and or software upgrade that will be required, making it a $4 million project. That's a big difference. Portfolio simplification is perhaps the greatest overlooked benefit of asset management. Say we're supporting 20 to 30 different applications in a given functional area where 2 to 3 would meet 80% of the need. The cost and complexity of supporting all these apps is usually many times the actual software cost. Knowing this can really help us simplify. Beyond that, we have the usual cost savings and compliance areas. But let's consider the last point, cost leverage. Having cost as a weapon, can we proactively influence user choice? We'll talk about that more a little bit later. Innovative IT organizations are truly beginning to understand that their value is in delivering what the customer needs and wants in a high-quality experience. But they don't actually have to provide the technology solution because the customer doesn't care about that. They just have to make it available for quality consumption. This in turn is leading IT to focus on delivering true services rather than technical outcomes, which is fueling the emergence of this role of the service owner. Someone who owns the outcome the customer really wants from end to end. So what does this mean for configuration management? This change in role is very significant. As you can see, there's quite a bit of difference between the role of a technical manager and the role of a service owner. This slide is a bit of a simplification, but it isn't incorrect. You can see that as a service owner, you have many more questions you need answers to. These questions arise when we see the service from the customer's eyes. Notice the bold blue items. These are questions where accurate configuration management data can help the service owner. And it's 75% of the questions in that column. These differences now make configuration management absolutely critical. Here are 5 functional elements that only configuration management can bring. End-to-end, modular and reusable, true cost of service, KPIs the customer cares about, and visibility from top to bottom. Configuration management is the decision-making support base that underpins all IT services. We're going on a journey from start to finish, and since we haven't really done this before end to end, and we'll have lessons to learn, policy, process, and technology to design and build, and it will be at least twice as hard and take twice as long as we think it will. When that is the case, it's best to choose something very important, even strategic, because when the going gets tough, which it will, we won't abandon it. Along with that, we want to start with something small, a manageable universe of data points we can understand and manipulate, with manual intervention when need be. For asset, this might be 2 or 3 top software licenses, or a class of high-value servers. For configuration, perhaps we focus on 1 or 2 high-value Tier 1 type services, only ones that really matter. Whether for asset or configuration management, this approach works. Actually, this approach works really well whenever you need things, whenever as a group you need to learn something. First, intend to complete the circle, the full life cycle from start to finish for the customer, provider, and the manager, all the parties that matter. Next, think top down, very clearly why you are doing this so that you can limit what you need to the absolute minimum and then go get only that, nothing more. Everything is a service or a subservice, so as you map your processes and roles, think modular and reusable. 3 or 4 reusable modular processes in a given area can usually meet 80% of the needs. We talked about limiting the data. Along with that, though, we need to put in place our initial data curation closed-loop process, which will be unique to us and improve the quality of our data over time. Last, use this opportunity to begin collecting cost data elements at every step or sub-process along the way to the extent they have them. And the reason that it's good to do it at those points is because that's where the actual knowledge of that cost and that data exists. So let's consider this in light of delivering a service. Every service we deliver is made up of lots of little services. And even though one person, let's say John Smith, owns the big service here, there are lots of little services being combined from different parts of IT to make up the big service. And this is true for us today. So how does service asset and configuration data help John? It provides the detail of the components in each subservice. So John, without having to call up and ask everyone, can have meaningful data on capacity, availability, time to provision, quality of service, service issue resolution, and service outage restoration. It allows him to see his service end to end, to quickly fix it when it's broken, and continually improve it for the customer. As a service manager or owner, I get requests from new potential customers to be consumers of my service. These may be end customers, or perhaps it's another provider who will use my service as a subservice in their delivery. When I accept this request, the new customer is added to my active customers in configuration management, so I know at all times who is consuming my service. As a service manager, I can also see other services being offered by other providers in configuration management. Let's say I find one that will add value to my service. I can request access as a customer to this service, which becomes a subservice or a supporting service to my service. At the same time, the subservice provider has a new customer, me. A lot of what we did traditionally in configuration and asset management was below the double line in the middle here. The hardware and software technology components and their relationships to each other. For our purposes today, I'm calling this the discovered infrastructure. Above the line are the services. The service usually consists of people, processes, descriptions, functionality, options, and service commitments, as well as technology underpinnings. Most of what makes up a service, CI, or aggregation of CIs, can't be discovered. But that may not be a huge problem because the service isn't as hard to track as moving technology like a virtualized server. You can see that each orange service above is consumed by some customer. It doesn't matter. That customer may be another service, or it may be the actual end customer. It is relatively easy as a service owner to add and track consumers of your service, as well as adding or tracking the subservice you consume to deliver your service. This makes it pretty easy to quote-unquote discover your services map in the CMDB. Now, the coolest part about it is if you follow this process, it's always accurate. For the example above, the dotted lines that are going down on the left and the right-hand side show our service from top to bottom. Most IT organizations are at a very low maturity level when it comes to IT costing. This prevents IT in many ways from driving customer choice or participating in the fundamental conversation of business, which is the cost-benefit trade-off conversation. As we move to IT services, IT organizations are beginning to see this as mandatory rather than nice to have, but it's still really hard to do well. So whether we actually get cost reimbursement or just do some kind of showback retail pricing, it is still very significantly affects consumer behavior because nearly all of us have a negative emotional reaction to wasting money. It's just how we're wired. Just as importantly, it allows us to lead the customer where we want them to go by creating standard, bundled, what we would call Happy Meal kind of offers around the 3 to 5 activities we do most of the time as a provider of a service, and then using 2 powerful consumer levers, excuse me, cost and delivery time. In this way, we simplify the customer's decision-making and the work of IT at the same time. Asset and configuration management data, we can't do this without it. Now we get to our 5th and final best practice, aligning metrics from top to bottom. Again, we start with the customer, whomever will be using our data or our service. Customer KPIs cascade down in a pyramid from the customer to the service owner to the service providers, sub-service providers. KPIs become SLAs, SLAs become OLAs as we go down the pyramid, and then it all rolls back up to deliver against the KPIs. Then when we work as a team, service end to end, we continuously seek to improve our service delivery as well as the measures of our success helped by the visible alignment to the customer driven by the KPIs. With SACM, Service Asset and Configuration Management, enabling modular, reusable sub-services, we could even trial build a prospective service, a service that we might want to offer, and look at what the performance and delivery might look like end to end by adding up the sub-service SLAs and OLAs around delivery times, performance, and even cost. So it would give us kind of a what-if capability. So in summary, data problems will take the life out of your learning efforts, so really limit them. Start with the end in mind, with the intent to complete the circle. Be proactive in designing a clear process to improve your data. And it doesn't have to be terribly complex. Manage from the customer down rather than the provider up. This will ensure you align naturally with your customers and the business, and you don't get things involved in the process and in your data that you don't need. So where to start? Most of our customers begin with a short plan analyze kind of engagement to create a clear logical plan and get everyone on their team on the same page with the same language. What we do follows kind of an analysis process flow here at the top, from high-level current state to a best practices-based desired future state, and then defining the gap between the two and building a phase plan to address the gap. It's fairly logical. This is done across the domains of hardware, software, configuration, discovery, and management and governance. Not only does it provide a logical phase roadmap, this engagement also gives you an analysis and recommendation of your roles and responsibilities in these areas with an accompanying RACI chart. It gives you a CMMI maturity scoring by functional area, which clearly identifies the gaps and allows them to roll up very, very logically and well connected into that 3-phase strategy and roadmap. We bring all the workshop findings, recommendations, and materials, and then we have an executive briefing that goes through all of that as a delivery exercise. And last but not least, we have a detailed potential phase 1 activity set and cost estimate, which is a statement of work, basically. So that's all I have to present today. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and he'll demonstrate some of the concepts we talked about here in ServiceNow.
Thank you, Don. So I'm going to cover a few things from an asset and config perspective, but I want to kind of start the demo story and kind of where customers can kind of drive or initiate kind of an asset management activity, as well as kind of how we want to maybe support the customers with that. So I'm starting with kind of our self-service portal. This is built on ServiceNow. This is using the service portal application of ServiceNow to present the kind of experience. And one of the things that we've kind of bubbled up in this particular kind of environment here is this request for refreshing my computer. And so this could be a case of where maybe as a consumer, they've maybe got a computer running a little sluggish, maybe want to be able to request a new update for their equipment or replacement for their equipment. And this person currently is not eligible. You will see as part of this form, if I wanted to make this request on behalf of somebody else, I can also check on them and kind of start that process to refresh somebody else's or request to refresh for someone else's equipment. But I want to kind of show this flow, this process, and I'll just do it on my behalf, who I am. I'm running a registered machine in this environment that is eligible for refresh. So a couple of my options here, kind of trying to simplify this from a consumer perspective as best as can be to say what are my needs. In the case, is a business-based laptop good enough for my needs, or do I need one that's more for development purposes? And then based off of that, I've got different models I can select from within our standards list of library. Right, so I'm just go ahead and choose this one. And then from here, to complete kind of my order, I need to kind of just make sure I've reviewed our device metrics, our matrix, my conforming to our device policy, and there is going to be some chargeback allocations as part of this particular piece of equipment. I'm just making sure that my cost center is basically okay with this particular process. And so I'm going to say yes, all is good. I'm going to proceed with my order. And now I've got a request number, and I've got an option here where I can kind of track kind of this process. So as a consumer, I basically just submitted a request to say, hey, I really could use a replacement for my computer that is now eligible for refresh and replacement. I can see it's currently waiting approval from Don, who's my listed manager. And I'm going to kind of shift at this point to kind of the native view to kind of show the rest of this process, and kind of where asset management, where some of the asset management tools at ServiceNow can kind of come into play here. So first of all, the reason for kind of the approval in this workflow of Don is because Don's listed as my manager. It's more and more of a business level approval to make sure that it's okay for me to proceed with getting this replacement computer. Don might just say, okay, everything's great, I'm going to go ahead and approve this, which then kind of moves it to its next step in the process, which is basically for our procurement or sourcing group to evaluate kind of where or how we could source this particular request. So our procurement group gets a task in ServiceNow to say, go ahead and source this particular item that's being requested. Now, in an ideal world, we would source these kind of high volume or standards kind of equipment kind of from our stock rooms and have a stock on hand to support these kind of requests, especially if they're high volume or come in, on a more natural or regular basis. In this case, there are no items in stockroom available for replacing or servicing my request. So the only real option we've got here is to source this from a purchase order. All right, so we've got one vendor that we can kind of buy this from, buying one. And then when we order and receive this, I want this to come into our kind of central stockroom for kind of triage to me as an end user. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this. And now I've got a purchase order line complete. And basically the sourcing task and the procurement's role within this kind of activity has been completed as well. All right, so now because we're not able to pull this from stock, we're going through kind of another kind of workflow to actually purchase this good from Apple and receive it and then ultimately deliver it to me as a consumer. Now, this process can certainly vary from one customer to the next in terms of how you want to implement this or your different tools involved. But I want to kind of show this is what we see is kind of very common in terms of ServiceNow kind of commingled with maybe another financial system like SAP or Oracle Financials. And so this is kind of got a first process here to move this to kind of an approval step, which at this point is where it's going to reach outside of ServiceNow and kind of initiate a process, in our case, into an SAP environment. And we've got kind of an SAP kind of cross-reference number here. So what's going to happen then is an SAP is going to handle kind of the financial approval of this purchase. They're going to come back to ServiceNow kind of through a REST web service and say, it's been approved. We are now moving this to an order kind of status, which is then going to, move this to a kind of ordered kind of state. So now we've got the order placed with Apple. And then ultimately this same SAP process is going to say, we have received the good, send a notice back to our ServiceNow environment that it's now can move to the next kind of step within the process, which this would be basically that it's received from a financial perspective, we can issue payment to Apple, and in essence, the good has been qualified that we actually have it on stock. So this then hands it back over to ServiceNow and those people working in ServiceNow to actually receive this item kind of from a stockroom and an inventory perspective. And so this receive activity in screen, it's got a couple options here. One, you can notice if we were ordering multiple things, we can do partial receipts. So if I'd only ordered 10 items, if I got 5 in, I could denote that I'm receiving 5. In this case, it's just 1. The other option we have here is this is where we can start the kind of asset tag, kind of inventorizing process of our new equipment that we just received and just purchased. Now this is where we oftentimes see customers use barcode scanners, especially if you're doing a bulk kind of purchase, right, where you basically scan the item that's come in, feed in what the asset tag is and serial number is for those particular items. I'm just going to go and use kind of a date tag, and I'll do the same thing for my serial number. So I'll put an SN prefix to it. And then reserve for me. You'll notice there's a little reserve flag here. Right, so reserve for me as an individual to where this particular equipment's going to go. And that's just going to basically, because at this point we're not giving it to me as an end user, but rather we're receiving it into our stockroom and we're denoting it as reserved so that if any other requests were come in for the same model, they would not be in essence distributed to somebody else because it's already currently reserved for me as part of this overall request. So you'll notice it's in the stockroom reserved for. So I do also want to highlight here, you'll notice that we're starting to, at this point by hitting this process, we're capturing financial information about this equipment. When did we buy it? When was it kind of ordered, received? What were the different tracking line items for this? Right, so we can do things like depreciation based off of what it's purchased, whether it was purchased or leased. And we're also going to track kind of total cost of ownership. We got the initial cost here, but any other expenses we can kind of build into this particular total cost of ownership for this equipment. All right, so that's the kind of purchasing process. And then the last part of this, you'll notice it's not complete, but basically the workflow, once it's been purchased, needs to be configured and then delivered to me as an end user. So there's a couple handoffs here to our field services group to configure this equipment. And so they're going to finish this task out. Another thing I want to highlight here too before I go close this thing out, you'll notice this is my new laptop that I've we just ordered. Here's my reference to my old laptop that I'm getting rid of. So this is actually going to cover both retirement of my old equipment as well as kind of configuration of the new. And then ultimately we've got to deliver to customer kind of activity. And now our process is complete. All right, so as a user, the last kind of step in this process is now that I've basically got a replacement. This is my new primary computer that I just refreshed. Right now, if I try to go through refresh computer, it'll notice I'm not eligible because I just got this until I can't get a new one for another couple of years based off of policy. All right, so in this kind of example, this is kind of helpful in terms of, I mentioned kind of going through and purchasing rather than going from a stockroom. Though ideally, if you're purchasing things like equipment that you're going to deliver a lot of requests related to this, you do want to have kind of a stock on hand. So one of the things that I want to highlight that is available inside the ServiceNow kind of toolkit are these stock rules. And so one of the things you can do with these, say for example this model right here, is you can basically say, I want to track and monitor the number of these items that we have in this particular stockroom. If it falls below this particular threshold of 5, go ahead and trigger a reorder process with the vendor to order 15 new. This how many to order basically is going to just kind of tell me how many we currently have on hand. We have really only 1 in our stockroom, so we need to basically a short 4 from this replenishment. The other thing worth highlighting with here is that there are kind of 2 ways of defining these. You can do kind of a purchase with the vendor to replenish the stockroom, or you can replenish a stockroom from some parent stockroom. So you could be doing purchases to a centralized stockroom and then distributing through transfer orders inventory from one location to the next, and there's a whole workflow around that kind of transfer order process. So that's obviously a great way to kind of, you're using the procurement kind of process to capture kind of new assets that are purchased, right? The stock process can be useful for handling what is moved from a stockroom to in use. But I will say a lot of our customers, I think where you get your items may come from discovery. They may not be hardware items, and so you might end up importing these items kind of through your integrations with discovery tools or through data loads or manually entering the configuration items or assets. So one thing I did want to highlight that kind of fits into that fits into this particular I guess concept of kind of ensuring that your data is complete and accurate. There's another kind of activity or application in ServiceNow called data certification. This is a plugin. And where this can be helpful is if we're loading a lot of data in ServiceNow, we may want to validate that it's current and accurate in review, especially if it's not coming from a registered discovery tool or some sort of trusted source. If it's being manually managed, we can use these certification schedules to kind of provide, in essence, an audit of our configuration data on a regular basis. So I just want to kind of show quickly what one of these looks like. So basically this one, you set up a schedule. This one's set to run on demand, but you can see I have different options if I want this to run, say, on a quarterly basis. Maybe every month we want to do a review of our configuration items that fit this particular definition, or maybe we do this once a year, right? Those can all be defined. And so what we're doing in this particular case is we're first defining what is our kind of set of information we're going to go after, which in this case is just our Oracle databases within our configuration repository. And then we're going to say there's some display information we want to show the people reviewing this so they know what they're looking at. And these are the attributes we do want to certify on a periodic basis. And then we can define who we want to send this to. In this case, we're sending it to a group, but we could send it to specific individuals. So maybe the owner of a service needs to review their service record on a monthly basis. Maybe the assigned to individual needs to review and certify certain attributes. Right, and so what happens, then you have days to complete. And so what happens is you basically have a way of triggering a review work activity for a group or individual to look at our configuration data and basically audit and validate certain attributes. So in this case, we've basically routed one task because we had this based off a group. If it was based off individual, I'd have a separate task for every individual that needs to do a certification kind of activity. Then here becomes the different configuration items to review, kind of flag whether the version's correct and current, and either say yes or no, this is something that needs to be remediated, or this is something that basically checks and is validated and is complete. So that's kind of a data certification to kind of review, audit, and kind of queue up work activities in ServiceNow, kind of related to your configuration data. All right, so the next thing I want to know is kind of where Don was finishing up on in his slides, which is really the value of kind of your relationships between your CMDB and maybe your either service items or configuration items. So I actually want to start. I'm going to start at kind of the infrastructure level, and I'll kind of show kind of how this can value, or these relationships can kind of drive kind of better service visibility. So I'm going to show, if I can find the right guy. So this is a server that we've got in our configuration repository. So likely this server would have come in through Discovery, CCM, or SCCM, or other ServiceNow Discovery tools to be loaded. But then there's also, you notice here, there's all these related items. And I'll show you this from a map view so you can see it a little more clearly. But the key thing I want to highlight here is basically this is a server that's running some applications, and that these applications were mapped and defined as being relevant to our identity management service. Right? But then identity management is basically a dependent service to some of our other parent applications and services. Right? So if this server goes down, these applications aren't available, identity management can't function, and therefore things like Workday become unavailable because they can't utilize these sub-services that they're dependent on. All right, so just to kind of show this, I'll go and create a new incident for this server. Right, so I'll put myself as the caller. And I'll define this server and say, server is running hot and melting building. Pretty severe issue going on with this server. I'm going to say it's create an outage based off of this incident. And I'll just define the same message and just say our outage is starting right now. Now the thing I want to highlight with this is, so because of those relationships in our seem-to-be data and kind of how this one server kind of supports our business applications and our business services, this one outage that I just created right here basically just spread itself to all these impacted services and created outage records for each of these. And the reason for some of this duplicating the multiple outages is so that there's tracking of downtime for all these different services, but also separate reporting to these different service impacts. So you can basically communicate to, say, identity management consumers with a different kind of message, or Workday consumers with a different kind of message. But you will see these are all kind of synchronized, so that if I were to, say, change this particular date, say it actually started at 8 a.m., not right now, you'll see all these other ones that are basically tied to that same kind of event have all been adjusted as well. Now, as a consumer, I kind of showed getting the consumer starting right. So as a consumer, there are messages being communicated to me that, hey, here's some services you utilize that are currently in a down situation. All right, so I can kind of go click on this and go to the service status page and see, I can see, oh, there's a bunch of outages out here with these different services. They're all kind of representing different messages, so the service owners can communicate different messages related to these outages that are pertinent to their particular service. All right, but so that's kind of a case of where one core configuration component that impacts our upstream services, if it goes down or is degraded or has some sort of service-related issue, it can be represented and communicated to all these different service consumers that are upstream impacts to it. So one last thing I want to hit on this is I'll kind of take this same scenario, but let's go the change route and kind of how change and this kind of same configuration item can kind of, work together. So I can do the same thing if I'm making a change to this, or reporting or planning a change related to this configuration item. All right, maybe I'm going to say here, upgrade firmware to resolve overheating situation, which is obviously the cause of my outage I just had. So we'll do that. We'll put this into our software group. And I want to, let's schedule this for, let's choose next Friday. I'll say close to the end of the day. I'll just do 2300. And then I'll say this wraps over into next Saturday at 1:30 a.m. And I'll save this. Now, because, again, this particular configuration item is mapped upstream to have service impacts, it's going to take into account those services as part of this kind of conflicts. You see, I have conflicts are detected. So if I go to my conflicts tab, we'll see, well, it's basically telling me that I'm outside the maintenance window of one of our impacted services, which is for somebody, if I'm in the server group recording this change, I might be like, well, it doesn't really affect me, but it does, because this is actually a change that upstream impacts our Workday, and we have an agreed maintenance window of when we can actually make this particular change. And I can also see down below, I can see all my different impacted services. So all of these different services are basically part of this change because of the dependencies between the server and the uses of these and these services that use it. All right. In this particular case, I can go look and see maybe I can be flexible in my schedule. The maintenance schedule for Workday looks like it is Saturdays between 1 and 4. So maybe my schedule, I can maybe don't have to be locked into Friday night. Maybe I can move this to, instead, maybe move this to that Saturday morning, maybe at 2 a.m. to say maybe 3:30 a.m. Right. So if I save that, adjust my times, you'll notice I no longer have a conflict because now I'm inside that maintenance window of my impacted service. All right. So that's one aspect of this in terms of the impact of the service owners. The other part I want to hit on too is kind of the authorization of this particular change. Let me just go ahead and approve this just to move this to another step within the workflow, and I'll kind of show you where the service owners come into play here. So if I look at my workflow for this change, we basically moved through technical approvals, but you'll notice now we're in the stage where we're getting kind of CAB approval, but we're also getting approval from all the different service owners as part of this. And really the idea here is that because it impacts the Workday service and DocuSign identity management, we want these different service owners to understand this change, sign off on it, authorize it, and be able to accurately and communicate this to their customers and consumers. So I think just one last part, since I started on the service portal, I also highlight too that once the change moves to a certain stage, it is also being posted out here as part of a planned maintenance activity as well, right? So now that it's been approved through the technical review phase, it's been posted out here as an upcoming planned maintenance. So as a consumer, I can also come to the portal, see that Workday has got an upcoming planned maintenance activity for next Saturday, and be able to know that the service will likely be unavailable or in a degraded state as it's going through that activity. So that's about what I wanted to cover as far as kind of the different options or things that you can kind of use ServiceNow for to support asset and config. Obviously having good foundational data and having good relationship data can drive a lot of value and kind of game changers as it pertains to driving some of these services.
Thank you, Jeff. So if you found any of this interesting, here's some possible next steps. Perhaps you're interested in our advanced self-service portal and catalog, which Jeff was demonstrating, and as you can tell, it goes a long way from the customer experience into exactly what IT is delivering against that customer experience. It is available as a fully functioning self-service demo. It's fun and easy to use. Over 1,400 people have signed up for it to date. You can get a login from our website and be using it in 5 minutes. It's fun. You play with it. You can't break it, to our knowledge. And it'll give you a sense of what that advanced experience is, a complete experience, end-to-end, built on Service Portal. It's also the top-selling product and most viewed product in the ServiceNow software store. Or perhaps you're interested in establishing a better asset and configuration management direction. Maybe take a look into our asset and configuration strategy and roadmap that I mentioned there. In a few short weeks, you can put your team and your program on a firmer ground, a better basis with a clear path going forward. And last but not least, maybe you're interested in a totally different way to meet your ServiceNow demand. If so, please check out our entirely new way of delivering services for ServiceNow with Evergreen Evolve. So that's all we've got for today, and I'll open it up to questions, Steph, if we have any.
We do have some done. Jeff, looks like most of them, or all of them so far, are for you. We always kind of laugh because poor Don never gets any questions. So if anyone has any questions for Don, I encourage you to make his day and submit them now.
I welcome your process questions.
So Jeff, let's see. Once the asset is created, how are you maintaining the corresponding configuration item?
So yeah, one thing that maybe in this, I guess, depends on if you're new to ServiceNow. I'll just give you a quick little background on kind of how ServiceNow does asset and config and ties the two together. But basically at the asset level, there are what are called model categories, and really the model categories define kind of whether it's an asset only, whether it's an asset that creates a specific type of configuration item. And so some examples are you might have like a software license, which is an asset that doesn't create a configuration item, but obviously in my case, a laptop kind of fits both areas where it's needed for both financial asset management and tracking, but also is useful for kind of managing from a configuration perspective. So what ServiceNow does is part of those is that by creating an asset in a specific kind of, in my case, hardware computer kind of classification, it automatically created a configuration item as well. And there's some synchronization of attributes, so like status changes, state changes are synchronized between the two. But then there are attributes that are managed kind of separately. So like the financial attributes of lease versus acquisition would be done on the asset record, whereas configuration attributes like memory size and running software would be at the configuration item level. And so oftentimes what you'll see is that you'll have kind of a combination of both in terms of updating, having processes to update the configuration record, as well as processes to update the asset record. And then usually a lot of the configuration data you can get updated through discovery tools. That was a long answer, but hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, another related question, Jeff. Can you configure the outage of affected CI in the relationship map to highlight that icon?
Yes. So there are, so ServiceNow calls it I guess it's a business service map or dependency map. It's been called a couple different things. There are what are called decorators. So you can decorate an icon on that map based off of it having active outages. You can have it decorate on there if it's considered a high priority service, or if you've got active change records, you can decorate it. So there's different ways to kind of color and maybe additional icons related to those kind of boxes that are on the map.
Okay, super. Thanks, Jeff. Another one for you. Are there pre-configured integrations between ServiceNow procurement and other systems?
So I would kind of assume this question is kind of related to financial systems. And as far as I'm aware, nothing that ServiceNow has directly authored, though, you know, I'd say through as kind of in this demo, from an engagement perspective, a lot of things that we've worked on, we've seen a variety of integrations be done. You know, I'd say some of the systems I've seen integrated between ServiceNow and for procurement is SAP. I've seen Oracle e-Business. I've seen PeopleSoft. I've also seen a number of integrations to kind of the providers or vendors that source equipment, right? So there'd be integrations for that. I will say that there are a number of third-party integration as a platform kind of solutions that can also be helpful in this area. MuleSoft, SnapLogic are a couple of them that I know have integrations to both ServiceNow and a variety of financial systems.
Super. Another one for Jeff. Is it recommended to have each service owner approve every change that impacts their service?
So from a best practices perspective, probably yes, though I think in this is probably the case with anything, you know, kind of from a best practice ITIL perspective, is you do want to balance kind of what's practical in the environment. So I would imagine if you had a service that was being impacted by, say, 100 changes per week, that may not be practical for the service owner to actually review, authorize every single one of those, right? And likely would just be doing a rubber stamp as part of that. So may make sense to have a deeper level set of rules to maybe assess the risk of the change, and maybe just the highest risk changes actually get formal service owner authorization, whereas maybe the not as high items, maybe they just get sent as maybe a notice or notification to the service owner.
Okay, another one for you, Jeff. What is the best way to set up the business service relationships between configuration items and their impacted services?
So, you know, Don kind of hit on this a little bit in terms of the, you know, what's sustainable and what's not sustainable. And so certainly the infrastructure mapping of kind of what's your environment and how that supports your different services. You know, ideally you want to probably use some sort of discovery tool for some of those kind of more dynamic, ever-changing infrastructure kind of relationships. So like network routers or databases to servers, those kind of things can change fairly regularly. So you probably want to have something that's more sustainable than maybe a manual process. But I will say for kind of like in my example, I had relationships between identity management and DocuSign and Workday. A lot of those service-to-service kind of relationships could be managed more from a change management, service portfolio management kind of process, where they're maybe manually recorded as a dependency, rather than trying to build that through a auto discovery mapping kind of tool. Because oftentimes that can be a little more challenging to assess kind of inside the actual configuration of application if it is actually utilizing another service or not.
Okay, great. Jeff, we got a couple other questions. Bear with me, folks. I'm scrolling through them. Let's see. If you can build a punch-out catalog from the ServiceNow service catalog to a vendor's catalog, i.e. CDW or Insight, you could probably sell that in the App Store. Okay, hold on a minute. I think it was more of a comment. Sorry. How do you explain upstream? Sorry, we are 100% live, folks. How do you explain upstream versus downstream relationships?
Well, yeah. So I mean, I think so. When you define a relationship, you kind of define in terms of whether it's kind of a parent, I guess, parent to child kind of situation. And so oftentimes it's like in the case of the map that I had, you define that an application runs on a server and that a service depends on an application or a service depends on another service. So in your actually defining those relationships, you're kind of denoting the direction of that relationship, of which is it depends on versus runs on or is running on or running to or whatnot. There are some parallel kind of relationships like connects to, connects from, that are not as much parent-child. So usually when we refer to upstream, downstream, it refers to more of a dependency relationship that in the case of like the map, if you picture the map I showed in the demo, the server is at the bottom and it has an upstream impact to the services that are depending on it. So hopefully, that's probably not the best answer, but hopefully that answers it to some degree.
Okay, and I'm just doing another quick scroll through here. I don't see any more questions, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. You will receive an email from the Ready to Talk address that you received your confirmation from. You'll get that email either later today or early tomorrow with a recording as well as the slide deck that our presenters used today. I also encourage you to go over and visit evergreensys.com. We have a new look on our website, and also be sure to visit our blog. Thank you, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.